Welcome back, you hear Goldberg. Today I'll be talking about Ian Smith and Rhodesia. Now, it's difficult to get good sources on this period of history because, on the one hand, you've got the lies and caricatures, on the other, Bitter Harvest, The Great Betrayal, which is Smith's autobiography. Understandably, it's going to portray him in a good light, but from the totality of information that I've been able to gather, he was essentially a pro-business conservative with some reservations about handing over a modern economy to a group of people who had collectively, although not exclusively, shown themselves to be butthurt, resentful, and somewhat vindictive. What we'll do is consider how Rhodesia came about, and then towards the end address perhaps what is a more realist colonial policy that can be viewed in a couple of examples as compared to failed alternatives in parts of Africa. Rhodesia was actually founded in the 1800s as a corporate subsidiary of a bigger program by Cecil Rhodes. And over the course of 80-90 years, it goes from a relative backwater into this very impressive free enterprise system where you have agricultural, mining industry, a formidable military. I actually have the Rhodesian SAS survival manual, which is very fascinating. You had good health standards, educational offerings, pretty much what you want to see if you're going and developing an area over a period of time. At one point, you have the Federation of Rhodesia, and then in the 20s, it was an opportunity for Rhodesia to join a political union with South Africa. Smith says not doing so was a mistake because it would have increased the South African European population by more than half. And this gets to a very important issue. He also points out once the national government came to power in South Africa, they ended the more liberal migration standards of the prior regime. And that was because they felt that the new coming migrants were going to vote for their opponents. But over time, you see how that actually perhaps did them in faster than they would have liked. So we'll get more to that point at the end of the video. In the 1960s, we get the Declaration of Independence, which was basically Rhodesia saying, we're tired of British colonial policy, you're not helping us, we're going to go our own way. Well, London responds by trying to turn Rhodesia into pariah, saying, more racism, and applying sanctions. And Rhodesia is more isolated than it was before, obviously. Now, for clarification, the Rhodesian system is not as it's been portrayed. It certainly was far from apartheid. Essentially, the Europeans managed the national government and economy, but then they cooperated with tribal chieftains who had a lot of authority over tribal councils and much autonomy. So those are basically different realms, I guess you might say. But even there, Smith was committed to making it more participatory and a majority, native voting system. However, understandably, if you're part of a minority that pretty much has built up the economy, you don't want to just run the risk of handing it completely to individuals who are not serious about any type of maintenance and want to just go crazy. So there was the idea of maintain a certain number of seats. I believe it was going to be 20% would have been for the Europeans under the ultimate settlement, and even that was not acceptable to Mugabe and his friends. Here we have Bishop Abel, who was a leader of one of the more moderate black parties, and Smith had envisioned that him and his associates would take over. So you'd have this working majority black democracy without eradicating all of the economy and infrastructure that had existed beforehand. Wistful thinking, as it turned out to be, because what Mugabe and his criminals, or you might say associates, did is they ran around launching terrorist attacks, intimidating people to force a result in the last multi-party election where he won the majority, and with his allies they were able to just turn the country into a socialist casino. An aspect to appreciate in Rhodesian history is the role of geopolitics. So you have Zambia, which is causing conflict to one side. South Africa, not entirely helpful with maintaining its border security policy. There's the Bush War going on. You've got Tanzania, which had gone to Nyerere. He was just a nutcase communist, destroyed the country. This is all a collection of pressures, sanctions from various European powers, but at the same time you have the Portugal proxies. Portugal, up until the early 70s, was ruled by the Estado Novo, founded by Salazar, and then towards the end, Marcelo Caetano, but they had Mozambique and Angola. This is why the communists were so insistent on taking out that regime with the Carnation Revolution, because then, of course, the dominoes fell. Rhodesia became more economically isolated. You've got, in the United States, Kissinger had negotiated a pretty effective settlement, and then Jimmy the Peanut Carter came in and said, "My heart does not allow me to proceed," and he abandoned it. So a lot of these European powers, the reason they refused to just accede and work with Smith towards a more effective solution is that they insisted on simping for the communists. They would not just allow, okay, let's work in a moderate fashion. They wanted the communists included. And that was really the downfall, ultimately, of Rhodesia. It was not just internal. It was external powers trying to flex their, we're anti-racists, even if you're actually making things worse. All this foreign meddling helped Mugabe and Nkomo, the leaders of ZANU and ZAPU. Now, Mugabe tried to play the whole "I'm a moderate, I'm not going to do anything." Meanwhile, he would just turn a blind eye to his followers, attacking and murdering people, disrupting the electoral system. Other figures generally associated with them include a guy called Sithole, and then there was our friend Canaan Banana. He was president for a time and later on ran out of the country and accused of being a homosexual. So, African politics are really interesting. But suffice to say, once Mugabe had taken power, very rapidly it was just write government checks, destroy private industry, kill or just force out of the country everyone who knows how the economy is meant to function. And we have the Zimbabwe of today, quite sadly. Once more, you have to make the distinction, going back to Bishop Abel and others. There were people who said to Smith, African people, you are much better than Mugabe, because it just became this, well, yeah, we're going to take back control, and you make it that much worse for pretty much everyone instead of being grateful for what you have. It's similar to when we were talking about the Shah of Iran. You don't have to like his whole regime, you don't have to like all the practices, but recognize these are wins. Let's take the wins and maybe move in a different direction instead of lighting a fire because we're just angry. We can probably take a lesson on colonial policy from the history of Rhodesia. If you just want the corporate subsidiary, get in, make some money, and leave, it's one thing. But if you actually plan on having a nation state, then strength in numbers, demographics matter. The British did not do this aggressively enough as far as migratory policy with Rhodesia. Certainly in South Africa it didn't occur. I've always thought the South African government towards the end should have just said, we're going to make this autonomous Volksstaat for the Afrikaner civilians who are going to be targeted for reprisals when they end up being a very small portion of the population spread out across the country. You could point to, or actually I should know quickly, the Belgians and the Germans. Yes, it was brutal, but they were more realistic. We're going to create new countries here. We have to diminish the local population. Otherwise, inevitably, you're going to have a small minority, like in South Africa, that regardless of whether they try to maintain that political system, eventually they're going to be overrun by sheer numbers. Now, in the U.S., instead of a small minority governing over the natives, you brought in so many people that they could actually make this new country viable on a long-term basis. I said in the book on Mussolini and fascism with Libya, it wasn't just go in and take resources. It was 20,000 Italians a year, colonialists, over a 5-year period, 100,000. By the 1960s, you've got basically 50% of the population will be Italian, which means less chance of, oh, we're just disenfranchised Arabs and we're angry, we're going to become communists and try to take you out. The French did this to a certain degree in Lebanon, although not on the scale probably necessary to truly bring it under their control in the long term. So numbers matter, people matter. And if you're willing to do that, it requires much more than just some money spent or some military brought there, some technology. You need to have enough people. That, I think, is the big takeaway from any colonial project. It's in a certain degree, it contributes to the success of any nation, having, generally speaking, a roughly homogenous group. We know that the United States is not 100% one ethnicity, but it's just something to be aware of.